equivalence to the victory sought in Iraq back in 2003. The conventional wisdom about war that prevailed in those days has been completely discredited. No one believes any longer that U.S. forces possess the ability to achieve decision quickly, economically, and cleanly. Rather, infatuated with counterinsurgency, the officer corps itself has given up on the idea of war as such as an instrument of decision. The officer corps no longer believes in battle per se. The officer corps has embraced a new mission of armed nation building, with success achieved, if at all, through protracted and exceedingly costly exertions. U.S. general officers today sound less like George Patton and more like the pioneering social reformer Jane Addams, full of plans and promises to eliminate corruption, encourage good governance, and promote economic development. Based on the revisionist interpretation of Iraq, some influential thinkers in national security circles now speak of the United States embarking upon what they call a global counterinsurgency campaign. I want you to try to wrap your brain around that one a little bit. So here in Afghanistan, the next chapter in the long war is to be written. The prequel now becomes the sequel and the focus of attention. The war in Afghanistan that Bush began, neglected, and then bequeathed to his successor now becomes Obama's war. Not a war to be settled quickly through a demonstration of shock and awe. No one believes that fantasy any longer. But one to be waged over the course of years, consistent with the dictates of the counterinsurgency field manual written at the behest of General Petraeus. With this decision to prolong and to escalate the U.S. military presence in Afghanistan, President Obama has put his stamp of approval on this approach. In doing so, he has failed to ask what exactly the long war has accomplished, what the long war has cost, where the long war is headed, and what relevance, if any, the perpetuation of the long war has to the threat posed by violent anti-Western jihadism. Will winning in Afghanistan, however winning may be defined, appreciably reduce that threat? Is it not at least as likely that U.S. and allied military activities will exacerbate that threat, reinforcing the widespread impression of Western hostility toward Islam itself? Afghanistan makes no sense strategically, except as it may contribute to a strategically coherent long war. Yet the long war, the enterprise launched with expectations of changing the way they live, has been devoid of strategic purpose since at least 2006. Meanwhile, Washington's approach to sustaining this war also raises uncomfortable moral questions. This is, after all, a conflict in which 1/2% of our fellow citizens bear the burden of service and sacrifice, while the other 99.5% of us carry on as if the war did not exist. It is a war that we even refuse to pay for, choosing instead to fund it by imposing on future generations a massive debt. Both of these, in my view, are simply unconscionable. So the long war flunks strategically. And the long war flunks moral. It's long past time for Americans to notice that fact. Our inability to do so, or worse, our refusal to do so, does not speak well for the health of our democracy. And with that, I'll stop, and I thank you very much.
I think what we'll do, since we have a little extra time, is begin with just a few questions, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and continue. That would be okay.
That's fine, sure.
I'd like to just ask one question, particularly given your background, and I wondered if you could at least ponder it, and that is, if you could sit down and have a beer with General Petraeus and ask him candidly, and of course off the record, what he thinks we're doing in Afghanistan, what do you think he would say?
Well, I have no idea. But regarding the president as a very smart guy and a tremendously talented and shrewd politician, as I ask myself, why the heck is he doing what he's doing? The only answer I've been able to come up with, and I don't find it myself tremendously plausible, although there's a logic to it. And the answer I came up with was that the president came into office with a vision of his presidency that perhaps was not unlike the vision that Lyndon Johnson brought to office when he became president at the end of 1963, and especially after Lyndon Johnson was elected president in his own right in 1964. That is to say, that just as Johnson viewed his mandate and his agenda in terms of bold domestic reform, so too did Barack Obama. It's my speculation. And because he is a shrewd politician, he recognized the need to prioritize. And frankly, probably could well have, I don't say probably, could well have assessed that if he's going to be able to implement his domestic reform agenda, he needed to act quickly to advance that agenda, simply because presidents tend to have more clout early on in their terms than later on. So the priorities, I'm speculating, that he set were domestic agenda first, national security, foreign policy agenda second. In other words, he said to himself, I'm speculating, I will defer the really tough issues on national security until I win my second term in office. By then, my domestic reforms will be in place. And therefore, I will not make an effort to shut down the Afghanistan war in my first term, recognizing that if I do that, I'm going to have a huge fight on my hand with those who favor the national security status quo, and that fight could undermine the chances of getting the domestic agenda put through. That's my speculation. Now, here we are in year 2 of his presidency, and in many respects, his domestic reform agenda appears to be in considerable jeopardy. And the president has already squandered, maybe too strong a term, but certainly has watched his prestige and clout and influence dissipate remarkably rapidly. So he's in a situation now where he may get neither his domestic agenda nor major national security change put through.
Very good. Let's take a few questions. I'm going to start right here in the middle.
Professor Bacevich, my name is Tom Lumber. My question is, when one reads about the internal deliberations before the president went into Afghanistan, increased what we did in Afghanistan, the word Pakistan was everywhere. And that's not the long war, there's a terrible problem with Pakistan, they have nuclear weapons and so forth. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
No, I'm not, did you say that's not the long war? It's emphatically part of the long war. I mean, the long war is this enterprise in which we today find ourselves, and I'm not trying to say this to justify it, this is descriptive.
Right.
It seems to me that the long war today has many fronts. There is the dwindling Iraq front. There is the far more substantial front of AFPAC. You know, it is one of the Obama administration's innovations to link Afghanistan and Pakistan together as if it were a single problem, and you can make an argument on that case. But there is a front in Yemen. There is a front in Somalia, and quite frankly, I dare say there are probably other fronts that we're not aware of because the operations are being conducted in the black world. So Afghanistan is part of the mix. I mean, excuse me, Pakistan is part of the mix from my view. But if I could rephrase the question a little bit of, given the fact that Pakistan is obviously a very tough nut to crack and is not a place that I think any amount of American power is going to somehow fix, how might we reconceptualize the long war? How might we conceive of a strategy that would have some of the coherence that I'm charging is absent from the policy we have right now? And I think the place to begin trying to answer that problem is by accurately assessing the threat. My own view would be this, that the threat is real, but falls far short of being an existential threat, at least as far as we, the United States, are concerned. 9/11 happened not because Al-Qaeda was 10 feet tall, but because we were stupid. We let our guard down. I mean, our government, federal, state, local authorities failed to put in place minimally adequate measures of airport security, which permitted 19 thugs with box cutters to perpetrate this horrific crime that killed 3,000 of our fellow citizens. We don't let the 19 thugs off the hook, but we simply note the fact that every government agency up and down the line failed. Something which basically nobody has fessed up to yet on the government side of things. So the threat is not an existential one, but the threat is a real one. I believe that in contrast to people in the Bush administration and others after 9/11 who compared this to a new Nazi Germany and bin Laden as a new Adolf Hitler, that it would be more useful to depict the jihadist threat as an international criminal conspiracy, one that in some senses derives its energy from a sort of a warped interpretation of a religious tradition, but nonetheless kind of a mafia on steroids. And in order to address a mafia on steroids, you don't invade and occupy countries. What you do is you mount a posse, an international police effort, ruthless, sustained, well-resourced, to go identify the networks and destroy them. A project that would take a long time and probably would never be any more fully completed than the Boston Police Department is able to fully eradicate violent crime in the city of Boston. But an approach that, in my view, would be both more effective and a lot cheaper than the approach we have taken thus far, relying on large-scale military action. Now that said, if you go back to how I described the Bush administration's freedom agenda, their strategy, this is not stupid. Their strategy said, you know what we need to do? We need to recognize that there are conditions in the Islamic world that give rise to this sort of violent behavior. And what we should do is we should try to address those conditions. And again, they thought the way to do that was to invade and occupy countries and, you know, impose democracy. That's not working. But nonetheless, this issue of the conditions deserves our thought. What are the conditions that give rise to this violent behavior? Probably we could have a long discussion about that. You know, that there's an absence of development, that there's the Israeli-Palestinian sort of issue that annoys and angers people. That there's a history of antagonism between Christendom and Islam, and so on and so forth. And I'm not saying those explanations are irrelevant, but my own sense is that the heart of the issue is that people in the Islamic world are wrestling with the very difficult problem of how to reconcile Islam with modernity. How can you be a believer and still live comfortably in the modern world? This is, I think, a very difficult thing, especially in a religious tradition in which belief and politics are so deeply intertwined. But let us note that we in the West also face that challenge. And that the problem of reconciling religion and modernity in the West also gave rise to violence, dysfunction, wars, conflict over a long period of time until we in the West more or less figured out a solution that is acceptable most of the time to most of us. And the solution we came up with, it seems to me, the reconciliation really is a reconciliation that takes the form of separation. You know, as a Catholic Christian, I'll go to Mass on Sunday and do all my Catholic stuff, and then on Monday I'll get on a commuter rail and go to work. And whether rightly or wrongly, whether it's good or bad, those two aspects of my life don't necessarily get in the way of each other. That's the way we did it. I think that's the way they're going to have to do it. But they're going to have to do it. They're going to have to figure it out. We can't shove the solution down their throat. So what that says to me is what we need is to think real hard about how to prevent violence that occurs as an offshoot of this internal struggle. How to prevent that violence from affecting us. What I mean here is we need a new strategy of containment. Not like the old strategy of containment during the Cold War, which was, you know, create a NATO alliance, send an American army to Germany, guard the Fulda Gap. Because the threat that exists is not the threat of the Red Army. But nonetheless, to try to think about policies to put in place to keep that dysfunction at arm's length from us. That's containment. Now, you remember containment in the Cold War was not simply sending an American army to guard the Fulda Gap. Containment in the Cold War also incorporated engagement. There was a certain amount of interaction between West and East. It was intellectual, it was cultural. I would argue that it didn't have a decisive effect, but it probably on the margins had a useful effect. You know, when we sent Louis Armstrong to the Kremlin to play jazz, that didn't bring about the downfall of communism. But it was probably a good thing to do. When we permitted Soviet scholars or East Bloc scholars to come to the United States to participate in exchanges, it didn't bring about the collapse of the Soviet Empire, but it was a good thing to do. So I think what we need is this international posse to go find the bad guys and take them out. A strategy of containment, try to keep dysfunction away from us, complemented with a certain amount of engagement, so that on the margins, again, on the margins, not claiming we can have a decisive effect, we can maybe show people that liberal, humane values actually are worth considering, and that we ourselves don't represent a life view that is necessarily antagonistic to religious belief. That'd be what I'd say.
On that note, so beautifully said. Why don't we take a 5-minute break? And I have 4,000 questions. I'm sure you do too. So